Alright, gonna make another video. Yeah, it's a pleasant evening, and so I feel like talking, so I'm gonna do it. And it's the same old subject. I'm just gonna try to put it into a simpler argument, kinder and gentler manner. But this is always kind of how videos are. I mean, the subject starts off kind and gentle, and then other people say something not so kind, and then you say something not so kind, and then they say something not so kind, and it turns into shit. But that's the way it goes. So I don't care one way or the other. I just don't like the hypocrisy of it, that's all. People just use the circumstance, they abuse it to slander messages by slandering messengers. It's just character assassination, and it's a cheap way to win an argument. It's almost back to the Venom Fang X thing. You know, let's destroy creationism by pointing out that the creationist is a lying crook. It's really irrelevant to his arguments. I mean, you have to defeat his arguments, not his personal character. And even if I was a despicable human being, it's quite irrelevant to the arguments that have been made. So deal with those arguments and quit pretending. You know, there's a bunch of people out there just pretending like they somehow counter-argued, and that they're somehow, their argument is just so strong and so decisively correct, and somehow I am ignoring that and defying that. No, it hasn't shown up. It's not on my radar anywhere, the rational argument. So first, dismissing the arguments that are just a waste of time. It's a waste of time to argue about whether or not suffering is a bad thing or not. It's a waste of time to argue about whether people have a clear and rather obvious choice when it comes to procreation. Maybe you could compare it to vegetarianism in the sense that, yes, there's a biological habit that we have become disposed to, but I don't even think there's proof of that in the vegetarian argument. But let's concede it. Let's say there was. Clearly, human beings are quite capable of augmenting their behavior to compensate, to find other ways to gain the calories they need, the sustenance they need, and the pleasure they need. And it's that simple. And because there is something wrong with this natural way, having children, i.e., quote, quote, that they can change that behavior. So there's nothing prohibitive about it. It will not cause somebody cancer not to have kids. So that's just kind of bullshit. It's not an imposition of a horror. It's not imprisonment in the dungeon of hell. So that's all bullshit. And I think the logical argument can be made that comparable to drunk driving, it's actually a behavior that is quite appropriately punished. And maybe should be, to prevent it. That the mandate should even be that strong. So anyway, so let's go through some of these basic arguments here. Now the first is the simplest. The argument to me made is that we are need machines. I've used that term. I haven't heard anybody argue that we're some other kind of machine. That we come into the world deprivated, in need, and the fact that we are sentient makes now it is the creation of a vulnerable welfare, an individual that needs caring. It needs to be cared for. It needs to be treated with such things as fairness and dignity, and it has all these things that a rock doesn't have because of that sentience. It has a welfare. It has a vulnerability to harm. That's what happens when you create a human being. Now the argument would be, because that serves no real purpose, creating such a thing, it satisfies no need that existed prior to its existence. There was no compelling service that needed to be satisfied. The universe doesn't have a horny penis. The universe doesn't have a hungry stomach. The universe doesn't have an ego. It doesn't need to go to France. The universe doesn't have any ambition to satisfy. So quite obviously, the introduction of this new human being can serve no purpose beyond the purpose of the individual creating it. it's all about what Dr. Frankenstein is doing, not about his creation having any purpose. And I would argue that we could clearly do without Frankenstein monsters, even if they are benign in theory. There would be no reason to create, if we could, 40-foot bunny rabbits that twitch their noses. And likewise, there's no reason to create vulnerable consciousnesses that are just going to be vulnerable to a whole desire and need mechanism that doesn't need to exist. So the simple phrase is, explain why need that doesn't need to be created should be created. Why should we create a need that doesn't need to exist? That's the explicit question. All right. Now, beyond that argument is this argument about why there's a danger. And the danger is created in the sense that we are developed by evolution. That's the context here. That it is unintelligent design, not intelligent design. That through the mechanism of our motivator, the engine of our perpetuation through the environment, the thing that forces us through the humus, is this mechanism of sentience, of a capacity to need and want and desire, and most certainly a capacity to be harmed, to be taught a lesson, so to speak, to be corrected for wrong behavior, wrong by natural selection standards, which would be don't eat and don't strip the flesh off your relatives to survive. That's wrong by nature's standards. Nature creates gladiators. It doesn't create civilizations or the civilized by nature. So there's a huge liability in playing this game, just because the mechanism itself is inherently dangerous to play with. It is, as I've described it, consumption, reproduction on an island planet. That means cannibalism. And when you introduce sentience as a motivator, you introduce the concept of addiction. Not purposeful mission, just a simple mission. The addiction is entirely devoted, the addictions, to accomplishing the purpose of the consumption and the reproduction. Nature really doesn't care about the cannibalism, but that's just the end result. And that is sort of, I suppose, natural selection cares about it in the sense that the cannibalism is part of the competition game. It is part of how you refine these instruments. You oblige them to gain these extra features, these better tools, by forcing them to compete. You force them to sharpen their swords. You force them to come up with more insidious weapons. And yes, so you will build a brain that way, because you will force organisms to be calculators and schemers, to be able to function in the competition. You have to win through an advantage, and definitely having a scheming intelligence will give an organism an advantage, as the success of mammals demonstrates. Alright, let's understand that success is pretty much completely dependent upon the eradication of the old lords of the world, and their eradication was pretty much dependent on the fluke event of a comet hitting the earth. So anyway, that's a whole nother context, a whole nother argument about the disposability or usefulness of this capacity to feel. So yeah, the simple argument here of the second argument is that life is serving no purpose. It is unintelligent design. We are built out of almost nothing good, essentially. It's all bad ingredients, and that it makes no sense to perpetuate it. Not only is it not needed by the universe, even if the universe needed human beings to be here, we are so inefficient in how we manage this consciousness, because we are gladiators, we are cannibals, that we're going to exploit each other. we feed on the ego. We've been built to do that. And so we will climb silly mountains. We'll look for anything to climb, anything to get up, anything that gives us higher ground. So we can look down at everything else and say, ha ha, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, because that's what we're about. We're about superiority dance. That's what we're made of. We're made to superiority dance. And these are really negative features of our psychology, but they are the real core of our psychology. There really would be no capacity to derive pleasure if you didn't have that competition and that ego. I'd say except it have to be a very carefully refined human life. You'd have to substantially reorient our psychology and kind of Teletubby-ize us and make us just deliriously happy to get our bowl of porridge. But I think most people would realize, I mean, if humans were basically Teletubbies, that it wasn't worth being human then. Because that's part of the ego too. Even if you couldn't understand that psychologically, I mean philosophically, you could understand it psychologically, that you would feel kind of defeated. It's kind of like winning a fight with a cripple or something. You know, if you have a fight with a guy with no arms and legs, you're not going to feel good about winning. It's not going to give you much satisfaction. You want a real fight. You want a real victory. If you win by cheating, you know, you're just not going to feel very good about it, in all likelihood. And that's the psychology. But sometimes the psychology is going to match the philosophy in rare occasions. So anyway, alright, so that's two parts of the argument. I guess the third one is the important one about the imposition part. So let's say there was still some sort of need to do this, some sort of merit that hasn't been explained, but even we conceded that there was some merit. We still got the argument about how many victims are you allowed to create? How many kids who don't want to ride on the roller coaster, who vomit on roller coasters, are you allowed to drag onto the roller coaster because there's a bunch of other kids who do like it? So how many are you allowed? What's this idea of victimhood? How are you allowed to create victims? By what authority? By what merit? And so unfortunately, that sort of does require you. I mean, I can't even just concede the point. I can't just concede that life has a purpose, because it has to be the strength of that purpose that justifies creating the victims. So I will go back to the metaphor that you know, you're only allowed to drunk drive if you have a mission to accomplish. You're only allowed to speed down the road as a rescuer if you have a mission to accomplish, if there's some potential for you to rescue somebody from some horror. Now, there's no rescue mission here. I think we can all agree that the dead are not lamenting. They're not in chains in a dungeon. You're not saving them. So how do we justify creating victims? I mean, how, like I said, how do you defend it? How many people would you harm for your life? If you knew that was the equation, we can reduce it to that. We really, as a practical matter, can. If we really wanted to, we could do the statistics, and we could figure out just how many people die, you know, for each high-living Westerner. We can go look at the third world and find out how many people are exploited and die and are harmed. What percentage of that is yours? How many ouches is your comfort and your existence built out of? And just the fact that it exists, it will automatically necessitate that. You can't even live a harmless life. It's very hard to do, just because of the implications of everything you do. Somebody could have died for this camera, the technology used to convey these videos. Everything we do has the implication of creating victims, creating people who didn't take on the risk voluntarily. And again, how would you feel about doing that? How would you feel if you were dragging somebody on into the car and saying, I want to go to Happy Land. And I'm going to force you, because I can't go unless you go. So I'm going to force you to go, even though you get car sick. Would you do that to somebody? Would you feel okay about dragging them into the car, even though you knew they were going to hate the trip? So now we get to this word imposition. Because there's clearly an imposition here. There's a clear risk that every certain number of rolls of this dice will be snake eyes. And it will be an individual who will not find life pleasant at all. And who will hate, absolutely hate their existence. And turn out that way to regret it, to despise it, to condemn it. Maybe that'll happen after they get into the war to get a college education and they get their arms and legs blown off. Maybe something dramatic will have to happen for them to get to that place, but they'll get to that place. And how do you justify perpetuating a system that creates those victims? I can't justify it. I can't justify imposing on somebody else to get what I want. How do you do it? Huh? Yeah, it's an honest question, isn't it? So anyway, so those are 3 or 4 questions, issues that the other side hasn't touched with any kind of even a scratch, they haven't even thrown any dust in the direction of that argument to in any way defeat it, any of it. So let them deal with those issues, and let's not waste our time talking about how brilliant the human race is, or how functional it is, because that's old. That's an old dead fairy tale. There is no happily ever after, and there is no reasonable human ambition beyond cleaning up messes. Horseflies. Sorry. Distracted. I'm wearing a thin shirt and they bite right through it. Oh, bastards. Okay, till next time.